Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us at Rivercross Online. We're going to continue today with our teaching series on King David by taking a look at a difficult time in David's life. I'm going to do some interpretive storytelling to unpack this, connecting together events more or less starting in 1 Samuel chapter 13 to bring out the significance of what happens in chapter 24. So you might want to look up chapter 24 in advance. Let me begin with a question. Have you ever gone in search of a wilderness experience? It's a popular trend in the travel business. Well, at least it was until COVID-19. It's popular because people now live cluttered and complex lives, crammed together in cities, working at a breakneck pace, overwhelmed by connectivity in person and online, with no room left to just breathe, until we all throw up our hands and say, I just gotta get away from it all. So we leave it all behind, searching for simplicity, solitude, perspective, traveling to beautiful, wild places, off the beaten track, off the grid, life stripped down to its most basic. And the eco-friendly travel companies are there to help us, to take us whitewater rafting that wilderness river, or scaling a majestic mountain, or just settling into the beautiful silence of a remote land. And they know what we're searching for. The promises they make online say that they'll help us get away, simplify, make healthy choices. Like this one, a company that invites us, quote, to discover transformational travel, a journey away from home into a powerful wilderness experience that will enrich your life and improve the way you connect with loved ones and the world. Now that's quite a promise. But don't get me wrong, there's some truth there. Traveling to beautiful wild places can have life-changing impact as we trade in our phone, the calendar, our to-do list, and strip down to simplicity and solitude to help us gain some perspective on life, and maybe even to hear the voice of God again. So wilderness experiences out there do sound wonderful, don't they? But how about wilderness experiences in here, in our hearts? I think you know what I mean. Those moments when life is going along just fine, then suddenly the bottom drops out. Our marriage ends. We lose a job. Cancer shows up, or COVID-19 turns everything upside down. And now we are lost in a wilderness of the soul, bombarded by questions, overwhelmed by emotion, lost, but maybe also dimly aware that something, no, someone, might show up in these tough experiences to help us find our way. Which brings us to David. David experienced a wilderness of the soul while hiding out in the desert, in the Judean desert wilderness, a fugitive on the run from King Saul. And for David, at least, his wilderness experience out there in the desert and in his heart brought him back in touch with God. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's bring this story up to now. Israel's first king, as you know, was King Saul. The king's number one job always was to keep the people true to their covenant relationship with God. More on this in Deuteronomy chapter 17. So for the king, getting people to pay taxes so that roads got built, the garbage got picked up, and armies got raised was a distant second to this sacred obligation to keep the covenant front and center in the life of Israel. Which is why King Saul was a failure. His heart didn't beat for God. And he leads the nation away from the covenant until 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 34, the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. So God sends Samuel, Israel's first prophet, and the nation's spiritual leader, to find a new king from among the 8 sons of Jesse, one who will be a man after God's own heart. 1 Samuel chapter 13. You know the story. God directs Samuel to David the shepherd boy. 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 13. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him, and from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. David the shepherd boy is now the secret king in waiting, ready to govern in the power of the Spirit. Soon, David's faith and capabilities come to the attention of all Israel. Pastor Rob talked about this. David kills the Philistine giant Goliath, showing off his capabilities, but also his faith in God, his true secret weapon. 1 Samuel 17, David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands." So David the shepherd boy is now David the hero of Israel. And his life takes this meteoric rise. King Saul sees David's potential, makes him a member of the king's court, sends him on military missions. And David is always successful. 1 Samuel 18:14. In everything he did, he had great success because the Lord was with him. And women take to the streets, singing and dancing David's praises. Saul has slain his thousands, King David his tens of thousands. But it's not just military success. David is becoming larger than life in other ways too. He's now best friends with Jonathan, King Saul's son, and marries Michal, King Saul's daughter. David had it all, from shepherd boy to king in waiting to hero to military commander to a friend in King Saul's court to a member of Saul's family. David had it all. But for one problem, King Saul. Saul was an insecure and unpredictable man. His jealousy grows as David's fame does too. Then fear. Saul wonders just how long he'll still be king. So, 1 Samuel 18:9, from that time on, Saul kept a close eye on David. Saul's fear then turns to action. 1 Samuel chapters 18 and 19 tell the story. Twice, Saul tries to spear David to the wall and sends him on suicide military missions and tries to have him assassinated in his home. None of these are successful, but David's days are numbered. He escapes with the help of his wife Michal and runs for his life into his wilderness experience. David's wilderness experience takes him wandering from place to place, meeting up with important people, always just one step ahead of Saul, until he's finally driven into the Judean desert, a rugged land of canyons and caves where a person can hide forever. A bleak and desolate land that mirrored on the outside how David's heart felt on the inside during his wilderness of the soul. Think about all that David has lost. No longer the nation's hero, absent from the king's court, away from his wife Michal, their relationship never recovers, and no longer able to enjoy close camaraderie with Jonathan. David, the man who had it all, has been stripped down to nothing. He's fragile, vulnerable, barely holding on. But there's something in this story that we need to see. It's there, reading between the lines, that as David becomes the man who has it all, his heartbeat for God gets muffled by the noise of his success. Imagine you're David, once a humble shepherd boy tending your dad's sheep, now the darling hero of Israel. 4 times, 1 Samuel chapter 18 describes the growing public admiration for David's military success. And 6 words in verse 16 sum it all up. All Israel and Judah loved David. Imagine you're David, loved by the nation, even part of Saul's family. Do you think this might have gone to his head? Well, would it go to yours? It's safe to say yes. David, now all caught up in himself and distracted by his fame, becomes less attentive to God. And quite honestly, that couldn't change until David was stripped down to nothing again. I know this is a hard thought to consider, but David probably had to go through this wilderness experience to once again hear God's voice and become again a man after God's own heart. To borrow the language of those eco-friendly travel companies, it was indeed a journey of transformational change, but without the fun. So let's go inside David's wilderness experience now and see how this all plays out. David faces a choice. Either reject Samuel's kingly anointing, abandon his people, abandon his faith, and hide out the rest of his days outside Israel. In fact, he tries this in Gath, Goliath's hometown. Bad idea. Read chapter 21. Or he can stay true to his calling to be king, remain loyal to his people, and faithful to Israel's covenant relationship with God. Leave God and Israel behind, or renew his faith and call to both. This is where we discover that David's heart still beats for God. We know this because of where he goes. Desperate and afraid, David makes a holy choice to find refuge in the company of holy men, the prophet Samuel and the high priest Ahimelech. More on that in a moment, but let's be clear about something here. That word holy brings to mind this idea that you are selfless and good in such a pure way that it sets you apart from those in the world around you. But holy David doesn't look like that at all. David is holy in the sense that at least he's running towards God, not running away from God, which means that he's at least ready to meet up with God in his life again, even if desperately selfish self-preservation is where it begins, even if he's still more than willing to lie to get what he wants, which he does with Ahimelech, by the way. You'll see what I mean in chapter 21. So David heads to the two most important places of refuge in Israel, Ramah, where Samuel runs a school for prophets, and Nob, where Ahimelech presides over the tabernacle. You can see how David's mind is working here. David doesn't want to die. He figures that being with Samuel and Ahimelech is as safe as it's going to get. You can almost hear David saying to himself, Samuel, our spiritual leader and Saul's equal, who anointed Saul king, who interprets the laws of the covenant for Saul, who holds Saul accountable to those laws, Saul wouldn't dare mess with him. And Ahimelech, who takes care of the tabernacle, God's dwelling place, where the Ark of the Covenant is kept with the 10 Commandments in it on stone tablets from Mount Sinai, Saul wouldn't dare violate that. Now, as it turns out, David is wrong. Saul is more than willing to hunt David down even in Ramah, even in Nob, with terrible consequences for Ahimelech and his family. But David does find hope in the company of these holy men. And there's an important lesson here, that when David starts running towards God, though it starts off selfishly and dishonestly, God in his kindness meets him there at even this most basic sinful level and provides safety and takes care of him, supernaturally protecting him from Saul and his men, chapter 19, verses 20 to 23, while also making sure that he gets enough bread to eat and a sword for the battles ahead, chapter 21, verses 6 and 9. And that's a start. God can build on this to renew his relationship with David, and he does. Reading through the story of David with Samuel, it's clear that they spent a good deal of time together, perhaps even a few weeks, while David took refuge in the school for prophets in Naioth. So here is David spending time in the company of his spiritual father. We know they talked about what was going on. Chapter 19, verse 11 says that David told Samuel all that Saul had done to him, probably over and over, as Samuel patiently listened. But mixed in with David's list of complaints, they must have talked about God too, and prayed together as well, I'm sure. And how about David with Ahimelech? David asks for a weapon. Lo and behold, Ahimelech replies, "The sword of Goliath the Philistine whom you killed is here. It is wrapped in a cloth. If you want it, take it." Goliath's sword. For David, there was probably no stronger reminder of what can happen when you trust God. The memories must have come flooding back. You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty. And he grabs and takes the sword, as much to hold on to faith as to get ready for the battle. God uses Samuel and Ahimelech to push David from a self-centered faith to a trust in God with all your heart faith instead. But David needs to grow some more still. So God now moves David to another place to continue the growing. It's obvious that David isn't even safe with Samuel and Ahimelech, so he retreats deep into the Judean wilderness to the cave of Adullam. And in this place, David has a profound spiritual experience. We know this because David wrote 2 poem prayers, Psalm 57 and Psalm 142, about his time there. David is the only person in this cave, all alone. An empty place, a silent place that mirrors on the outside the empty despair in his soul. But at least David knows this now. God is there. His time in Ramah and Nob showed him that. So David in his desolation shouts at God. Psalm 142 verses 1-3. I cry out loudly to God. Loudly I plead with God for mercy. I spill out all my complaints before him and spell out my troubles in detail. As I sink in despair, my spirit ebbing away, you, God, know how I'm feeling. I cry out, God, I call out. You are my last chance, my only hope for life. There's an important lesson here, that although David is as low as he can get, he's at least ready to talk to God again, even if it's just a no-holds-barred list of complaints. Folks, when we find ourselves in a wilderness of the soul, honest conversation with God must begin somewhere. And in this moment, David, and hopefully us too, discover something, that when we start talking to God, God is listening and will answer back. David shouts, I'm alone, I'm miserable, help. And guess what? God honors David's raw honesty. 1 Samuel chapter 22, verse 1. David escaped to the cave of Adullam. When his brothers and his father's household heard about it, they went down to him there. So much for being miserable and alone. David's entire extended family clan shows up to comfort and encourage him. But look at what comes next. Chapter 22, verse 2. Then all those who were in distress or in debt or discontented gathered around David, and he became their commander. About 400 men were with him. That cave is getting mighty crowded now. Look, we need to understand that Saul was just not a good king. He'd failed to keep Israel true to the covenant, but he'd also failed to govern well. It wasn't just David who was hurting, it was everyone. These 400 men are a symptom of the problem, King Saul. They're stressed out and angry, probably because Saul had imposed too many taxes, and they've gone into debt to pay. See what's going on here, folks? God is sending David a message. He's saying, look, David, you ran to me, you cried out to me, I showed up, I helped you out, I protected you, cared for you, sent you comfort. But the moaning and complaining is over. It's time to grow up. God sends these men to David to give him a purpose, to become a leader again, to take this group of 400 malcontents and shape them into something. And if you continue reading through 1 and 2 Samuel, these men become the core of King David's army and serve on his governing council. With God's help, David is changing. And as he does, he finally realizes the truth. During his wilderness of the soul, he sought refuge with Samuel in Ramah, with Ahimelech in Nob, with a crowd of people in a wilderness cave. But now David knows who his refuge really is. Psalm 142, verse 5. I cried to you, Lord, I say, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. So it's the new and somewhat improved David, along with his band of 400 merry men, that we meet up with again in 1 Samuel chapter 24, deep inside another wilderness cave near the oasis at En-Gedi. Saul and 3,000 men are hunting for David. They're right nearby. Suddenly, Saul, all alone, enters the cave. Why? Well, let's be real here. To heed the urgent call of nature, which he thinks he's doing in private, but actually to an audience of 400 men. Now that's what I call comic relief. So here is David, the brilliant military man who always seizes the surprise with Saul at his mercy. David's men want him to take care of things right then and there. But David is a changed man. He's run to God and God showed up. He's spoken with God and God answered. He's once again becoming a man after God's own heart. The old David would have just plain killed Saul, but the new David instead shows Saul grace. Verse 4, then David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Even then, verse 5 says, David is conscience-stricken, feels guilty. Why? Because Saul is still God's anointed king of Israel. What happens to Saul is God's business, not his. David realizes that even his act of grace carried the threat of violence against the king. He shouldn't have even done that. Verse 6, the Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, for he is the anointed of the Lord. But look at what happens because David does choose grace over violence. Verses 8 to 13. David follows Saul out of the cave, hollers to get Saul's attention when he's some distance off, bows down to Saul as God's anointed king, then calls him father, reminding Saul that they are family, then shows Saul the cut piece of his robe, explaining what he could have done, and makes a vow, a declaration of grace. From this day on, verse 12, my hand will not touch you. Afterwards, an honest conversation takes place between them, during which Saul calls David my son and weeps, verse 16, then confesses the wrong he's done. Verse 17, you are more righteous than I, David. You have treated me well, but I have treated you badly. And finally, Saul acknowledges that one day David will be king. Grace given from David to Saul, grace received from Saul to David. And for a while, there's a measure of peace between them. That's what can happen when our wilderness of the soul leads us back to God. Well, David's wilderness experience is quite a story. Perhaps as you listened, you realize that you're in the wilderness right now. Maybe like for so many people, COVID-19 has left you feeling lost, adrift, frustrated, wondering when things will get back to normal, wondering where God is. Or perhaps COVID-19 has just magnified a wilderness experience you were already in, a marriage that has gone sideways, a job loss, a financial crisis, an addiction, a loved one with a serious health concern, a difficult situation with one of your kids. Look, whatever it is, we all experience times when the bottom just drops out of our lives and we get lost in a wilderness of the soul. So thank God that we find a story in Scripture about a person, David, who is as complicated, imperfect, and self-centered as we are, yet learns to find his way again. let me suggest to us that David's wilderness experience offers some helpful guideposts for when we lose our way. Number one, when you're in the wilderness, run towards God, not away from Him. That's the choice David made, to head to God with all the personal baggage he was lugging around, and God met him and started to sort things out. Number two, even as you're running towards God, cry to God for help. Even if, like David, it begins with a list of complaints. Who cares? It's still honest conversation. At least you and God are talking again. Number three, as you run towards God and start talking, expect Him to show up. David's story reminds us that we shouldn't be surprised when God arrives and speaks to our needs. Now, God's help might be supernatural, wonderful, but more likely, as with David most of the time, it'll be small miracles of practical care, good company, tasty bread, a sword for the fight, that we receive from people whom God sends as a gift. So please, don't push them away. Number four, when God shows up, yes, He'll meet your practical needs, but God will also push you in ways you don't expect. I'm sure that's how David felt when those 400 men arrived. But sometimes we need a good, strong nudge to move from self-centered faith to trust in God with all your heart faith instead. And number five, let the lessons God is teaching settle into your soul so that you, like David, become a person after God's own heart again and choose to meet each new challenge in God's grace. Folks, God can and does grow us through our wilderness experiences. I pray that you'll take these life lessons from David to heart and find your way home.